This is an apple. You can look at it from the left, you can look at it from the right. But it doesn't change the fact that this is an apple.
That's a clip from a CNN commercial promoting their facts-first approach to journalism. It came out at a time when former President Trump was openly attacking journalists as enemy of the people, suggesting they were playing politics with facts and spreading fake news. Misinformation and disinformation campaigns about journalists have flourished in recent years, and trust in the media has suffered. Many media outlets, like CNN, have sought to counter these forces through fact-checking and adherence to objectivity in reporting, a long-standing principle of traditional journalism.
At the same time, many in journalism are reassessing the role and limits of objectivity, what it means to be an accurate and trustworthy journalist, and how media should address systemic inequalities within democracy, including how those inequalities shape our news.
But beyond fact-based reporting, what does the commitment to objectivity mean? And what other values and assumptions do journalists bring to their reporting? And what voices have been left out or excluded from dominant media outlets? Indeed, some calling for greater representation in newsrooms have pushed back against this idea of objectivity.
These and other pressing concerns are increasingly important to think about, particularly in terms of how journalists gain or lose trust with their audiences.
I'm John Carlson.
And I'm Sarah Riccardi-Swartz, sitting in for Tracy Fessenden.
And this is Recovering Truth, a podcast from Arizona State University's Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. Today, we're joined by two veteran journalists, media observers, and members of our Recovering Truth project team.
Kristen Gilger is Reynolds Professor in Business Journalism at ASU's Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and Executive Director of the National Center on Disability and Journalism. And Anand Gopal is Assistant Research Professor in the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at ASU. He's an award-winning journalist and sociologist who has worked extensively in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. Welcome to you both.
It's nice to be here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the basics. What role has objectivity traditionally played in journalism as a value for seeking truth? Kristen?
Yeah, I mean, people think that the way we approach journalism now, or at least the conversation about objectivity in journalism, has always been the case. And that's actually not true. If you look back at the founding of journalism in this country, it was an extremely partisan atmosphere. The press was primarily used as a way to further the interests of political parties and political players. And so the whole notion of objectivity didn't really arise until around the mid-1800s. And it happened for a couple of reasons. One, business reasons, as news organizations got big and tried to reach large audiences with people with a lot of different perspectives. And also because I think the rise of the Associated Press and other news organizations were wire services essentially, and they needed to appeal to audiences from the deep South to the Northeast, and really help propel this notion of objectivity as a way to approach journalism. So not traditional in this country until not that long ago.
Anand, what would you add to that in terms of the value that objectivity brings, or perhaps its limitations?
I think the challenge in talking about objectivity is we tend to mean many different things when we say the word. One definition of objectivity is it's the opposite of subjectivity. It's the opposite of allowing your personal beliefs and opinions to influence how you report the facts, right? Another meaning of objectivity is that there exist true facts, truths out there, independent of whatever we happen to think about it. And those are slightly different meanings. I think when people tend to talk about objectivity in journalism, they're usually talking about the first, not the second. But in recent years, I think there's been a kind of elision between those two concepts. So I find it useful personally to talk about objectivity on the one hand and neutrality on the other as distinct but related concepts. So neutrality is when you have different, let's say, partisan positions or different moral views or points of views, and you don't take a side in either of those. And I think that is actually what most people are wanting to see in journalism is some kind of neutrality. Whereas in fact, if you actually look at or at least that's what they say they want, because if you actually look at how they respond to reporting if they find that reporting is not neutral in a way that's against what they believe, and they're opposed to it. So I think we have to reconsider what we mean by neutrality and objectivity in that context.
There's another way of looking at objectivity, though, and that's how you go about gathering information in the first place. So less about inserting your personal opinion into a piece as being objective about where the reporting takes you, and being complete about reporting in terms of sourcing, for example.
So you could be objective, but not necessarily be neutral. Is that right, Anand, Kristen?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that the method that Kristen's outlining is an objective method to try to find the facts out there. But you may want to find those facts while having certain moral beliefs or certain views of what the purpose of journalism is, which means you're not necessarily neutral.
So I think this relationship between objectivity and neutrality raises a question when we think about the expressions of facts first or facts-based journalism. Facts first or facts-based journalism is really that model that separates facts from values and opinions. And I think there's something that can be said about the relationship between neutrality and objectivity in that. What do you think about that, Anand?
Well, I mean, to start with, you can't have opinions without having facts to base those opinions on the one hand. On the other hand, I think one of the challenges is that when we have journalism that has certain implicit values, what makes it controversial is if those values are somehow divisive. So if you take, for example, like pedophilia, right? If you want to report on, let's say, a pedophile, no one's really expecting that you're going to have to get both sides of the story and ask the pedophile why he or she thinks it's right to abuse children. And the reason is because there's a shared value that's pretty kind of universal, at least in this country, about pedophilia. The problem comes when there's really no shared values, or there's divisiveness. And that's why I think in the last 10, 15 years, as we've seen more divisiveness grow, it can feel like journalism is now somehow less neutral than it was in the past. I'm not sure it is. It's rather that there's so many issues that we as Americans don't necessarily agree upon. And we're seeing that reflected in the way we interact with journalism.
So I'm going to do a follow-up here, and I want to throw it to you, Kristen. If, Anand raised the issue of both sides coverage, right? And there are issues currently in our media like racism, Holocaust denial, climate change, COVID. Should those issues be receiving equal coverage?
Well, I mean, it's a difficult question. I'm trying to think of an example. We had a group of students who were covering the rising number of hate crimes in this country. And to cover that story completely, they went and talked to the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, not to defend what they do, but to understand what it is they do. So I think that, it's not presenting both sides as being equal in value, whether it's the Ku Klux Klan or climate change, but it is not ignoring the fact that differences exist and why those differences exist and what motivates those differences. And I think those are all important questions for journalists to continue to ask.
So why are some journalists questioning the value of objectivity today?
We hear a lot about this from the young students at the Cronkite School, because they seriously object to the notion of objectivity in journalism. Many of them do. And what they say, and they have a valid point of view, is that objectivity is a white male construct, basically, that it is not a way to get at truth, other than truth as perceived by, a society dominated by white men, and that their objective truth looks very different. And I think there's a lot of validity to that. I think the problem becomes when they're inserting their own personal beliefs into stories because of that grounding. I think it's very valuable to have that perspective and to have them be out there reporting those stories. But it's a hard conversation to have with students, because I still believe in, maybe we use a different word than objectivity as Anand suggested, maybe it's neutrality or fairness. But even that, there's pushback.
Anand, do you agree that objectivity is a white male construct, or something that journalists of color shouldn't strive to achieve?
No, I don't. But I think part of this is also related to some of the terminological conceptual issues that I mentioned before. I think most of these people, and Kristen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess most of them would not be opposed to the actual process of doing journalism. Let's say
Yes.
investigating crimes committed by white supremacists, or investigating the sort of racist laws and structures, and the kind of actual work that goes into doing that, which is demonstrating certain truths through gathering evidence, documents, etc. I imagine they would support that process and see that as constitutive of truth, or at least one way of doing so. So if that's true, then it seems that what they're actually reacting to is the sense that perhaps previously to this, they were expected to have a kind of neutral sort of disposition towards this, whereas what they want to do is be able to sort of stake a moral claim on one side of the issue, and to them, that's what they mean by saying that they're not being objective.
Yeah. And Black Lives Matter would be a good example of that. Coverage of immigration issues is another example of that, where they feel that there's a clear moral imperative to, one position, and that the journalism should advance that moral imperative. That's where it gets, where you get to that line.
Well, I think it's really interesting that both of you have raised the term moral or morality in terms of journalism ethics. But what I'm wondering is what kind of values journalists should explicitly embrace, and what kind of values they should resist as they practice their work.
Well, what we teach students are the traditional values that Walter Cronkite represented so well. And we tend not to use the word objectivity these days. Instead, we say fairness and neutrality, completeness, accuracy. Those are the important things that we try to teach them. But, I think like Anand said, that if you can focus on the process of doing the journalism, how you do it, that I think that resolves a lot of the issues.
And it seems to me that much of what you're describing is an effort in some ways to pursue an objective approach to reporting.
Exactly. Now, we should say that sometimes the best reporting is not traditionally objective. Edward R. Murrow is a good example of that. Even Walter Cronkite's a good example of that. That there are times when you do have to speak out, when you feel the compulsion to speak out because it's so important for what is happening in your society. Cronkite spoke out against what he saw as the likely outcome of the Vietnam War, speaking a truth as close as he could get to the truth based on the reporting that he had done. And Edward R. Murrow stepped way out of bounds, so to speak, in reporting on McCarthy, and made a huge difference in doing so.
So the question of whose voices are included in newsrooms and the media and whose are not is a really important factor right now in either preserving trust or even increasing trust in the media. Kristen, I'd like to start with you. You've been an editor at many local newspapers. Who are the people who have traditionally been in charge of newsrooms? Who's been excluded? And how does that impact how the news gets reported?
Yeah, I've been in newsrooms since the early 80s. And the answer to your question is white men were in charge of newspapers. That started to change and has changed some, particularly with regard to gender. There are many more women who are running news organizations now, or seriously contributing to news decisions. It's not equitable. It's still dominated by white men, but there has been some progress there. And most recently, just in the last, I would say, year and a half to 2 years, there's been some fairly significant progress made for Black journalists and Black women journalists, which is notable over the past year or two. So I think it's changing, but still, this is an industry that has been dominated by white men since its inception. And it has taken a very long time to try to bring in those other voices. There are some other voices that I think are still largely excluded from newsrooms. And I think one of them is people with disabilities. that is like a whole new civil rights area that we're just embarking on. That's one of them. Certainly there are others. I mean, we could talk about inclusiveness from the point of view of, religion and age and various, gender stances and all racial stances. The newsrooms I have worked in tend to not have a lot of people who are Islamic, for example, or religions other than Christian religions. I think, that's also an issue. We're supposed to be reflecting the audiences we serve. And to some extent, the audiences we serve end up looking like the newsrooms that deliver the news because they don't see themselves and they're not represented in news coverage. So I think that's still a really big issue for news organizations.
Yeah, well, I think, as we've gotten remarkably more diverse with respect to various identity categories, race or gender or sexual orientation, we've gotten, at least in the national media, way less diverse when it comes to your class background. And I know for the big New York publications, for instance, the main barrier to entry is, you have to be upper middle class, essentially. Either you go to journalism schools, which cost a lot of money, at least here, I don't know about in ASU, but here costs a lot of money, or, work unpaid internships, et cetera. You have to end up taking all sorts of career risks that you may not end up taking if you are from a working class background. And so in the institutions I work there, I find them to be remarkably not diverse whatsoever. They may have people of color or whatnot, but their life experiences are broadly similar to one another compared to a large portion of the country. And I think that's a big problem because part of the surprise by the liberal media in New York about the 2016 election is one example of this. There's so many other ways in which this is a major issue that needs to be addressed. And I think it's unfortunately going in the opposite direction.
Anand and Kristen, we know that most media outlets, their drive is for ratings and profits. That's their business model. Does that business model work against the needs of democracy in terms of truth seeking or truth telling?
Well, let's tackle the business side question first. Clearly, catering to partisan interests and issues is profitable and has been profitable for some time for various news organizations. On the other hand, if you are a news organization like, let's take the Arizona Republic, for example, where you're trying to appeal to a geographic area that consists of a wide variety of people, I would say that that you have a need to include and direct your coverage to all of those people in order to ensure your economic viability. So there's really just two very different sides of that coin.
Anand?
Yeah, in the 30s, we had the Federal Writers Project, which was a really great program that helped unemployed, out of work writers. And it's just an example of the way in which government intervention to help journalism, there's ways in which that can happen. And this relates to the class issue that I mentioned earlier, where you have this structural impediment. Working class people are not going to be able to, for the most part, join these national media organizations. And there's a number of things that can be done one is looking at the issue of student debt and the outrageous price of cost of attending college. Two, programs like the Federal Writers Project that could target individuals who could actually bring a lot to journalism if they had the opportunity to go to it. And then thirdly, because you mentioned business models, I think we need to have more of a diversity of business models, one of which has to be or should be looking at, there's some great examples in Europe, for instance, of publicly funded news organizations. Of course, we have some of that here too, but the extent to which that could perhaps create something that's not seen as being too divisive and being more trusted than some of these other outlets. I think that's something to consider.
That was Anand Gopal, Assistant Research Professor in the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at ASU, and Kristen Gilger Reynolds, Professor at ASU's Cronkite School. Thank you both.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having us.
I'm Sarah Riccardi-Swartz.
And I'm John Carlson. This podcast is part of the Recovering Truth Project at Arizona State University's Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, in partnership with the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and supported by a generous grant from the Henry Luce Foundation.
Our producer is Sarah Ventry, additional assistance from Matt Correa. Our music is by Ketsa.
Recovering Truth is a civic responsibility. Thank you for listening and joining us in this effort.